The 1962 Marshall Bluesbreaker amp. We all know it as the famous amp that Eric Clapton used to create some searing lead rock guitar tones that would forever change the history of rock guitar. But this amp is actually even more significant than that. We're going to talk about this amp, its history, some fun bits that you might not know. We're going to talk about the practicality of actually using it in modern context, and we're going to deep dive a little bit with some tech aspects of it. I'm going to have Jason McDaniel from Singletone Pickups on, who's also an amp designer, and he's going to share with us some of the tech side of it, which is what made this amp so unique, so special, and so significant. I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy. So the Bluesbreaker amp. Here's the quick rundown of it for those of you that don't know. This is a story that's been told a lot of times, but Eric Clapton was an up-and-coming blues rock guitar player. There was a lot of buzz about him with his time in the Yardbirds. He had ditched his previous rig and was going for a thicker sound, and he also wanted an amplifier that would fit in the trunk or the boot of his car, and went to Jim Marshall for it. There were two Marshall combo amps. There's the 1961 and the 1962. Now, for those of you that don't know, the JTM45 was significantly influenced by the Fender Bassman, such that the 1961 Marshall combo actually much more resembled the Fender Bassman in the sense that it was also 410s. The 1962 is the 212 that would become famous. Now, Clapton's was a Series 2 1962. What he did was he took it into his session with John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers. He absolutely cranked it, and he played his Les Paul through it, and he played a lot of Freddie King licks and BB King licks, but just with this tone that people had not heard like this before. It was rich, it was harmonic, it had incredible sustain, and just absolutely changed the history of rock guitar. This is where you start to see the things like Clapton is God. Is it possible that he may have spray painted that himself? I don't know, it's conjecture. Anyway, many of us know that story, but there are other things about this amp that make it more significant in the history of Marshall and even relating to other companies. First of all, here's a really fun tidbit. The first artist that ever played this amp in America was not Eric Clapton, it was Roy Orbison. Now, when you think of an ES335 into a classic Marshall amp, Roy Orbison's probably not the one that you think of, but he is also an incredibly significant musical artist, great songwriter and performer, someone who influenced the Beatles and all kinds of other performers. And it's really cool to have somebody like that also associated with the history of this amplifier. Now, obviously, Marshall would, generally speaking, move on and become much more famous for the Stax. But before they really got to the massive stadium tone that Marshall's known for, they first had a hurdle to overcome, and that hurdle went by the name of Vox. Because Vox amplifiers in the 60s, they were the thing. They had been popularized by the Shadows, of course by the Beatles and many, many others. Vox under Tom Jennings, that was the amplifier to have. That was the sound of rock and roll in 1960s London in particular. Well, The later to be called Bluesbreaker amp was one of the first things that really gave Vox a run for its money, not just because of Clapton, but because this was an amplifier that sounded great, that gave you the combo, and was less expensive. And it gave Vox such a run for their money that actually Tom Jennings called up Jim Marshall several times with profanity-laced rants and things about why he couldn't do this or he couldn't do that. And the quality of this amp and the tones that it became known for really drew in a lot of artists who wanted a heavier, more powerful sound than what Vox was giving. Vox eventually would go through a whole series of trouble, up to the point where, interestingly, much later on, both had an umbrella company of Korg, and Jim Marshall was tasked with reviving the AC-30 many, many years later. But with creating a new sound for rock and roll in general, one that was affordable and one that established Marshall as a serious player in rock and roll, and something that would kind of change the overall voicing of rock and roll going into the late 60s and into the 1970s. Now, that's some fun tidbits about the history of this amplifier. This particular one that many of you have heard in a number of recordings of mine, this one is a modern reissue. One thing that is notable about this amplifier is that it's very, very loud and it's very, very heavy, which means it's not particularly practical, particularly if you're going for the classic Clapton sound. If you're going to absolutely tank this amplifier, which I have already done and will do more in this video for you guys. I'm doing it for you guys. It's also just really awesome to crank this amplifier whenever I can. Anyway, a couple of unique things, and the tech side that I do want to focus on are the speakers and the tubes. Now, mine has 5881s. They're Sovtek 5881s, which we're going to talk about a little bit more coming up with Jason McDaniels, but they're very, very like 6L6s. In fact, they actually say 5881/6L6s, and these tubes are somewhat interchangeable between 6L6s, 5881s, and KT66s, which is what Eric Clapton's most likely would have had it, and I believe that's pretty well established that his had KT66s. We're going to talk a little bit about what of difference those make as far as the amplifier and why I decided to stick with the 5881 6L6s that work with this. Part of it's because I can't use regular 5881s because of the plate voltage. Anyway, the thing that I'm a little bit more zeroed in on, because it's easier to swap out and I would argue makes as much if not more of a difference in the tone, are the speakers. Now, I've gone through a number of speakers in this amplifier. This one, when I got it, it came with a greenback and a vintage 30. Now, those are both great speakers, but together and at low volumes, they did not work in this amp, in my opinion. They made it much too bright and brittle, and those are two speakers that really work best when they're rip-roaring. So how do you take a classic Marshall and get the right sound out of it when you can't crank it up all the time? Because yeah, I'm cranking it up here in the studio for you guys for the video, but the reality is that even playing on big outdoor stages, you just can't crank this amplifier. It's just too loud. And I have done this live. I played this amp at a festival last year, and I didn't really get it up past 4, I want to say, before the sound guys were saying, like, can we bring that down a little bit? That's just how loud it is. Well, at 4, even with an aggressive guitar, you're not anywhere near the Clapton sustain that we're talking about. So what I've been looking for are speakers that would make this sound rich and thick and warm and kind of honor the tone of this amplifier that it's known for, but do that at lower volumes. Also, this is, despite what many vintage Marshall enthusiasts will say, this works best in all practicality as a pedal platform. And it does that beautifully. It takes pedals like an absolute champ, not a Fender champ, you know what I'm saying. So we are going to try it with a few different pedals, including talking about some of the lore of this amplifier, which we're going to do in a minute here. The speakers that are in it are Celestion Golds, and I do want to say thank you to Celestion. They did send me these speakers to use in this amplifier in videos. So this is a sponsored part of this video of talking about the Celestions. Now, I know the rep at Celestion, and we discussed this a little bit because I had some ideas on speakers I wanted to try, and he had some ideas, and we decided on the Golds that these would be the best. Also, these are very, very likely similar to what Clapton had in his. And this is something that there is a lot of debate about. What speakers were in Eric Clapton's Bluesbreaker amp? A lot of people think they were greenbacks. I think it's more likely, and there are a bunch of people who also agree with my side of it, that it was these vintage Celestion silver Alnico speakers that were used in the early Bluesbreaker amplifiers. I'm sorry, I should say the early Marshall combo amplifiers, because the 410 also had Alnico speakers. There's a legend, and this one has been pretty well disproven, I think, but there was a legend that Clapton had also used a treble booster, Dallas Rangemaster treble booster, when he recorded with John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers. Now, I think that has basically been put to rest. I don't know if there's anyone still pushing that idea, but I think for the most part, people say he just plugged into the amplifier and let it rip. Now, I am going to try it with a really cool Rangemaster clone from True-Fi Pedals in this video to see how well that emulates the sound. But what's interesting to me is I've noticed through different amplifiers and different speaker configurations that the Rangemaster sound that we associate, that has a lot to do also with the speakers that you're playing into. And Alnico speakers also contribute to that tone. So it's likely to me that you could hear a cranked Marshall with Alnico speakers and mistake it for having possibly a Rangemaster going into it. Because a cranked Marshall with Alnico speakers sounds a little warmer, a little bit more articulate on the top end, and there's this like slight hint of nasaliness to it, like you would get from a Rangemaster. That's very, very different than the big, more akin to like a Brown sound that you're going to get from the ceramic speakers. And the speakers really do make that much of a difference, I found. So, what you heard at the beginning with the Les Paul, that was the amp full on with the channels jumped. In a minute here, first of all, I'm going to play it with a Stratocaster and play it with some sort of deep reverb and delay, just so you can hear how lush this sounds clean with these speakers, and just in general to maybe morph your opinion of what this amp can be. This is not just a, crank it and rip it amplifier, again, because that would just limit its use in any sort of real world context. But it takes pedals beautifully, and it has a really, really lovely clean tone. So in a minute here, we're going to try Fender Stratocaster with some delay and reverb. Then we're going to try it with the Les Paul and the True-Fi Rangemaster. Now, there's one other thing that I had heard, and a notable blues rock guitar player from the modern era, I believe, said this, but I can't find record of it. I looked, I read it someplace, somewhere, and it's the internet. There's just so much information around there now. I couldn't re-find it. So I'm not going to say what this person's name was. Most of you will probably be able to guess. But this person seemed to believe that you could get reasonably close to a cranked Bluesbreaker tone if you just plug a tube screamer into it. So we're going to try it with a Stratocaster with some delay. We're going to try it with the Les Paul with a Rangemaster, and then the Les Paul with a tube screamer, just a regular TS-808. And let us know, which one do you like better for the cranked Marshall sound? right, we have Jason McDaniels here who runs Singletone Pickups and also is an amp builder, so he's going to give us some perspective on this classic amp. How are you, and thank you for being with us.
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So my followers know I can talk tone, but I know almost nothing about the tech side of it when it comes to the circuitry. I can describe what different types of tubes will sound like tonally, but I don't really know what they're doing. So I wanted to get your perspective on what made these classic amps so special and maybe different from other ones that were around.
Yeah, of course. The JTM45, it's pretty well known that the JTM45 got basically its beginnings from Jim Marshall and his engineers basically copying a 5F6A, which we all know as the Tweed Bassman. But it really wasn't. It wasn't a true copy. Yes, the preamp section is pretty much spot on. They changed some values here and there, but that part was minor. The big changes in the JTM45 versus the 5F6A or the Tweed Bassman. One of the biggest changes is the fact that it used different output transformer. The JTM45 used, on average, used about a 6.6K output transformer. They were bigger, more iron. There's a little less sag in the JTM45 just from the transformer itself. And it also had 3 different output taps. You had 4 ohm, 8 ohm, and 16 ohm. The 5F6A only used a 4K output transformer, and it only had a 2 ohm speaker tap available. They were using 4 10-inch speakers, whereas the JTM45, it was set up as a head, and it was designed to work with closed back speaker cabinets. But a lot of people don't know that when the JTM45 was originally produced, all they could get for output tubes at the time were 5881s. So what you actually had was you had an amplifier with an output transformer that was not exactly perfectly matched to 5881s. So it kind of contributed to its own tone, its own kind of thing. The JTM45 had adjustable bias, and then, after a little bit, the 5881s went away. Later units had KT66s, and eventually, they all ended up with EL34s, and that's what we've all come to know as the Marshall thing.
It's my understanding that the Clapton one, and we talked about this because you helped me try to find tubes for my amp. It's my understanding that the Clapton model had KT66s. The modern Bluesbreaker reissues come with 5881s, and this one, which we tried to figure this out, would not take a traditional set of 5881s. It's the Sovtech 5881s, which are, you said, basically 6L6s. But when I crank it, as I'm doing in the video, it does still sound like a Marshall to me. So how much of a difference, in your opinion, from an amp builder's perspective, is the power tube? Is that just one of a bunch of different parts as to what makes up this tone, or how significant is that in reality?
It's just one of the parts. It truly is. It's just one of the pieces. You can nitpick output tubes, and output tubes tone really doesn't begin to shine until the amp is, as we like to say, cooking. That is where you'll start to notice differences. The 5881, a true 5881, like an NOS tongue sole, it's going to be a little bit brighter. The tone's going to be, for lack of a better word, and so most people understand, the tone will fall somewhere in between like a 6V6 and a 6L6, kind of like the old short bottle RCA 6L6s. They only dissipate 23 watts, roughly. So if your plate voltage is over 400 volts, you can't use an NOS 5881. Well, you can, but we're going to say you can't, just because people don't need to just stuff them in there and hope for the best.
Right, and that's what we went through when we were trying to figure out the amp, was figuring out what that plate voltage was.
Exactly. So the Sovtech 5881 that you're running, tonally, it's going to sound a lot like a 6L6. It has the same dissipation as an original 5881. So, when you had the tube shortage in the 80s and the 90s, people went in search of tubes that would substitute. And that was one of the tubes that was widely found. It's a Russian-made tube. They're used in MiGs. There's millions of them. And it had similarities to the 5881, and it would work in an amp that used a 5881. So they labeled it a 5881, and it works. Fender used them for a long time. Fender used them as OE tubes for a very long time. It's a very hardy tube. It's reliable. But if you're looking for the 5881 tone, yeah, it's not going to give it. Now, if you go to the KT66, the KT66 being a very big bottle tube, the best way to describe the KT66 when it's cooking, when it's really hot and everything's working, it's the way that it feels. It feels fluid. It's smooth. I guess some people use the word creamy, whatever kind of adjective that you'd like to use. It's just, in my opinion, it's more fluid, and the KT66 would be warmer. The 5881 is going to be a little brighter, and the 6L6 is going to have a bigger bottom end, and that's what I hear to my ears.
Yeah, and now, interestingly, because with mine, and it's almost a moot point because I so rarely get to crank it because I live in reality nowadays, and this amplifier, I think a lot of people look at them as, I don't want to say they look at them as obsolete, but for such a big, heavy amplifier where its historical significance comes from being cranked, and a lot of people just aren't using them anymore, or they're switching over to using something like the new lower watt Marshalls, like the Studio series, or there's the 1974 that's the single 12-inch. That's I believe that one's 18 watts. But this one, I definitely noticed has a brightness to it, and that's where switching the speakers actually helped, particularly at lower volumes, because the original Celestians that came in it, which were a greenback and a vintage 30, at low volumes it was just too brittle. And I tried a couple other different speaker sets, and some sounded fine and some didn't, but the Alnicos that are in it now, the Alnico Golds, they really warm it up. That kind of counters that. So I wonder how much that has to do with those tubes and the tube character, like you're saying.
Well, like I said, when we first started talking, it's the tube is just a piece of the puzzle. It truly is. The original Tweed Bassman, it used a 12AY7 in the first preamp tube spot, whereas the JTM45 has always used a 12AX7. So the JTM45 had more gain right out of the box. The negative feedback circuits in the 2 amps are different. That's why the Tweed Bassman's always going to be, it's going to sound a little warmer, a little grittier than the JTM45. And the JTM45 is going to have a more distinct line between clean and where it begins to break up. And those are just circuit issues, but it's the sum of all the parts. And I've always said that with greenbacks personally. A greenback to me does not sound amazing until it's loud.
I've generally felt the same way about them. It's an incredible speaker, but it needs to be used in the context that it needs to be used in.
Now, I will tell you something, my personal opinion. The JTM45, I believe at lower volumes, really, 3 reallys, shines with a medium output Alnico speaker. If you could ever get your hands on a set of the very early Celestion silver Alnico speakers, those are incredible, but they're a lot of money. Probably more money than you paid for the amp to get 2 speakers.
No, and that's interesting. That's actually part of the subject of the video too, is figuring out what are the right speakers for this. And also, there's not really, at least anything definitive I've found as to what speakers were in Eric Clapton's. A lot of people think that they were greenbacks, but it is possible that they were those old silver Celestians, which I've kind of made the suggestion, at least, that That could also lead to there's a legend that Clapton also used a treble booster. And a lot of people said no, he didn't use a treble booster. But I've also noticed that Alnico's speakers contribute to a tone that is in a way conflated with a treble booster tone because the character of the breakup is a little bit different. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. Is what I like to say is that, you know, when they were doing these studio tricks 60 plus years ago, there weren't any engineers who had the forethought to think that later on we'd all have baby televisions in our pockets and nitpick over what all the specifics of their gear was.
Oh, you're so right. But I'll throw you.
All right, that was Jason McDaniels. That video got cut off a little bit at the end. We had some technical difficulties, but I just want to say thank you to him again for being on. Now we're going to get back to some cranked tones, and I want to start by playing it with the Stratocaster. And I'm going to play the Stratocaster and try and get some modern Clapton tones and basically just see where we get. Now, interestingly, Clapton switched to the Tweed Twins, and he said in a video with Fender and Guitar Center, it was this thing when he was doing a series of reproduction gear, and he said he switched to the Fender Twin because they sounded like Marshalls, but they were more consistent, right? Whereas the Marshalls might have been a little bit more different from one to one. The Fenders kind of all sounded the same. But it's interesting, again, you know, knowing that this amplifier was based on the Fender Bassman, even though it became its own thing, that then he would go to Fender knowing that Fender still had a similar thing that was just a little more consistent. So we're going to try some Clapton tones with the Stratocaster going into the cranked Bluesbreaker. All right, lastly, the part that I'm sure you have all been waiting for, and that is playing this wide open with the Les Paul, just plugging in and ripping, no backing track, no anything. I'm going to play it wide open on the bridge pickup, and I am going to play it on the neck pickup with the tone rolled off as well, so you can get some of the classic Clapton woman tone. That's more of a thing from Cream and later, but it still just absolutely does it beautifully. So we're going to close out this video with playing some rip-roaring Clapton with the amp wide open. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Please let us know, what do you think of this amplifier? What do you think of the history of it, of the modern reissue? Is this an amp that you would get? Is it too big and loud and cumbersome? Would you get something like the smaller versions that they're doing now? I'm Jack Fossett. Check out Singletone Pickups below. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video.